Sarah was a kind-hearted schoolteacher who lived in a small, peaceful town. Her life was simple and full of routine, teaching children during the day and spending quiet evenings with her cat, Luna. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Sarah for her patience and warmth, always willing to lend a helping hand to anyone in need. She had never been in trouble a single day of her life. One ordinary evening, after finishing her last class, Sarah stopped by a small grocery store to pick up some fruits. She smiled at the cashier, exchanged a few words, and walked home, carrying her small bag of groceries. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and Sarah thought to herself how beautiful the moment was. But she had no idea her life was about to take a dramatic turn. The next morning, as Sarah was watering her garden, she heard a sharp knock at the door. Confused, she set down the watering can and walked to answer it. Standing there were two police officers, their expressions serious. "Sarah Harper?" one of them asked in a firm tone. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, feeling a sudden wave of unease. "We need to ask you some questions about a robbery that took place yesterday evening," the officer continued. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "A robbery? I don't understand. What does that have to do with me?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before answering. "A witness has identified you as a suspect. We'll need you to come down to the station." Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she said, her voice shaking. "I was at the grocery store and then went straight home. I didn't do anything wrong." The officers, however, were firm. "We just need to clarify some things," one of them said. "If everything checks out, you'll be free to go." Her neighbors began peeking through their windows, whispering to one another as Sarah was escorted to the police car. She could feel their eyes on her, their curiosity burning holes into her back. Sarah wanted to scream that she was innocent, but her throat felt tight, and all she could do was hold back tears. At the station, the questions began. The officers showed her a blurry photo from a surveillance camera. The figure in the picture vaguely resembled Sarah, wearing similar clothes to what she had on the night before. "This isn't me," she insisted, her voice trembling but firm. "I've never been near that place in my life." The officers didn't seem convinced, and Sarah's fear grew. How could they believe she was guilty when she had done nothing wrong? As the day stretched on, Sarah realized that proving her innocence would be much harder than she thought. For the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. But deep inside, a spark of determination began to form. She was innocent, and she would do whatever it took to prove it. Sarah sat in the small, cold interrogation room, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what was happening. The officers repeated their questions, and no matter how many times she answered truthfully, they didn't seem to believe her. The blurry photo they showed her was their strongest evidence, a figure in a hooded jacket, about her height, with features that could be mistaken for hers in the poor quality of the image. "This isn't me," Sarah repeated, her voice firm but shaking. "I was at the grocery store. You can check the security cameras there." The officer across from her scribbled something in his notebook, but didn't look convinced. "We'll verify your statement," he said in a tone that felt dismissive. "But the witness who identified you was very clear." Sarah felt a wave of frustration and fear. "Who is this witness? Why would they say it was me?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, but didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he leaned forward. "We're just trying to do our job, Miss Harper. If you're innocent, the truth will come out. But until then, you need to cooperate." Sarah nodded reluctantly, knowing she had no choice. After hours of questioning, they finally let her go home, but warned her not to leave town while the investigation continued. She walked out of the station with a heavy heart, feeling like the walls of her life were beginning to close in. As she stepped outside, Sarah noticed a small crowd had gathered. Some of her neighbors were there, whispering and pointing as she walked past. "Isn't that the teacher?" someone murmured. "I heard she was involved in a robbery," another said. The words cut through Sarah like a knife. By the time she got home, Sarah felt completely drained. She sat on her couch, staring blankly at the wall, trying to understand how her life had spiraled out of control in just one day. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet it felt like the whole world had already decided she was guilty. Later that evening, Sarah's best friend, Emily, came over after hearing the news. "Sarah, what happened?" Emily asked, concern etched on her face. Sarah broke down in tears, finally letting out all the emotion she had been holding back. She explained everything: the blurry photo, the witness, and the police's refusal to believe her. Emily listened quietly and then said, "You don't have to go through this alone. We'll figure this out together." Emily's words gave Sarah a glimmer of hope, but as the days passed, the situation only seemed to get worse. The police called her again, asking more questions, and the whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. Even some of her colleagues at school started to look at her differently. Despite all of this, Sarah knew one thing for sure: she couldn't let fear or doubt win. Deep inside, she made a promise to herself: she would fight to clear her name, no matter how long it took. Sarah woke up the next morning with a new resolve. She wasn't going to let this accusation ruin her life. She sat at her small kitchen table, sipping her tea, and began writing down everything she could remember from the day of the robbery. Every little detail mattered now: what time she left school, the exact time she entered the grocery store, and even the cashier she had spoken to. If she could piece together her movements, she could prove she was innocent. After school that day, Sarah met with her lawyer, Daniel. He was a young and determined man with a reputation for taking on difficult cases. As she explained her situation, he listened carefully, nodding as he took notes. "This witness's testimony is shaky at best," Daniel said after she finished, "and the photo is far too blurry to be solid evidence. Don't worry, Sarah. We're going to fight this." Sarah felt a small sense of relief. For the first time since the ordeal began, someone seemed to truly believe her. "What should I do next?" she asked. "We need to build a strong case," Daniel replied. "First, we'll gather evidence to confirm your alibi. Then we'll start digging into the police's evidence to find flaws. But this will take time." Sarah nodded, determined to do whatever it took. That afternoon, she went back to the grocery store where she had been the evening of the robbery. She spoke to the cashier, an older woman named Mrs. Peterson, who remembered Sarah coming in. "I remember you, dear," Mrs. Peterson said with a kind smile. "You always stop by after school. But I don't remember the exact time you were here." Sarah's heart sank. It wasn't the confirmation she had hoped for, but it was still something. "Do you have security cameras here?" she asked. Mrs. Peterson pointed to a camera above the entrance. "We do, but only the manager has access to the footage. I'll talk to him for you." Sarah thanked her and left, feeling a glimmer of hope. If the footage could show she was at the store during the time of the robbery, it would be a crucial piece of evidence. Meanwhile, Daniel was hard at work reviewing the police's evidence. He discovered that the witness who identified Sarah was someone who had only seen the suspect from a distance. "This isn't reliable," he told Sarah during their next meeting. "We'll challenge their credibility." As the days went on, Sarah felt a mix of hope and fear. The more she and Daniel dug into the case, the more she realized how flawed the accusations against her were. But every step forward felt like climbing a mountain. The gossip in her town hadn't stopped, and every time she walked down the street, she could feel the stares and hear the whispers. Still, Sarah refused to give up. "I'm innocent," she reminded herself, "and I'll prove it." With Daniel's help, she was determined to uncover the truth and clear her name. Little did she know, a breakthrough was just around the corner. The days turned into weeks, and Sarah's fight to prove her innocence became more difficult with each passing day. Every step forward seemed to bring new challenges. Even though her lawyer, Daniel, had uncovered some flaws in the police's case, the accusations against her still loomed like a dark cloud. Sarah felt like her life was on hold, but she refused to give up. One afternoon, Sarah received a call from Mrs. Peterson, the grocery store cashier. "Sarah, The manager reviewed the footage, and it shows you entering and leaving the store. I've asked him to save it for you." Sarah's heart lifted. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Peterson. This could be the evidence I need." She immediately informed Daniel, who quickly filed a request to include the footage in her case. However, the police were slow to respond, delaying the process. Frustration built up inside Sarah as it felt like no one in the system wanted to listen. She began to realize how hard it was to fight against a system that had already made up its mind. On top of her legal battle, Sarah was dealing with the fallout in her personal life. At school, some of her colleagues avoided her, unsure whether to believe her or not. Parents of her students started whispering about the accusations, and a few even requested that their children be transferred to another class. Sarah felt heartbroken. She had worked so hard to build trust with her students and their families, but now it was crumbling. Her neighbors weren't much better. When she walked through town, she could feel their stares and hear their hushed voices. "Do you think she really did it?" someone whispered as she passed. "I don't know, but where there's smoke, there's fire," another replied. These words hurt Sarah deeply, but she refused to let them show. She held her head high, even though every step felt like a battle. At home, Sarah tried to stay strong, but the stress was overwhelming. Her sleep was restless, and she often found herself pacing the room late at night, thinking about how unfair everything was. One evening, her best friend Emily stopped by with dinner. "Sarah, you're not alone," Emily said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You have me, and you have Daniel. We believe in you." Sarah nodded, grateful for Emily's unwavering support. But deep down, she felt the weight of the entire situation pressing on her. Meanwhile, Daniel was working tirelessly. He found more inconsistencies in the police's case, including discrepancies in the witness's timeline. "We're making progress," he told Sarah during their next meeting. "But the police are pushing back hard. They don't want to admit they made a mistake." Despite the struggles, Sarah's determination never wavered. Every setback only fueled her resolve. She knew the truth was on her side, and she was willing to fight for as long as it took. What she didn't realize was that the breakthrough they had been waiting for was closer than she thought. Sarah's determination was beginning to feel like the only thing keeping her going. The case had dragged on for weeks, and the accusations still weighed heavily on her. While Daniel, her lawyer, worked tirelessly on the legal side of things, Sarah continued to gather anything that could help her prove her innocence. But with each passing day, the pressure on her grew stronger. The gossip in town showed no signs of stopping, and the longer she fought, the more exhausted she became. One day, as Sarah was reviewing her notes again, she realized something that had previously slipped her mind. The witness who had identified her had claimed to see the robber fleeing the scene. But there was no mention of exactly how long after the crime this sighting occurred. Sarah's mind began to race. Could the witness have been mistaken about the timing? Could they have seen someone else? She went back to the police report to read the witness's statement again. It was a vague account, just a brief description of the suspect, and a mention that the person had been near the scene when the robbery took place. There was no concrete evidence tying Sarah to the crime. The only thing that connected her to the incident was a blurry image from the store's camera, which, as she had repeatedly stated, didn't look like her at all. As she sat at her kitchen table, the phone rang. It was Daniel. "Sarah, I've got something important. I think we found the key piece of evidence we've been looking for," Daniel said, his voice full of excitement. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked eagerly. "I've been going over the footage from the grocery store," Daniel explained. "The time stamp is crucial. It shows you were inside the store during the robbery, but there's a problem. The timeline doesn't match up with what the witness said." Sarah felt a rush of hope. "What does that mean?" "It means the witness could be wrong about when they saw the robber," Daniel said. "It could be that the witness confused the timing. And there's more. I spoke to the store manager, and they confirmed the footage shows the suspect leaving the scene much earlier than the witness reported." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time, she felt like she had a real chance to prove her innocence. Daniel continued, "This new timeline clears you of the accusation. The robbery took place after you were already in the store, so it couldn't have been you." Sarah sat back, trying to process the good news. It was a breakthrough, but there was still more work to do. The police would need to see the evidence, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. But for the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to feel hopeful. The next step was clear. Daniel would present the new evidence to the police, showing that the timeline didn't match up. But as Sarah thought about it, she realized how much this fight had taken from her. Still, she couldn't give up now. Her courage had brought her this far, and she would keep fighting until the truth was revealed. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a much bigger battle. With the new evidence in hand, Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope. The blurry photo, the unreliable witness statement, and now, the crucial time discrepancy from the grocery store footage. All of these things pointed to one simple truth: she was innocent. But she quickly realized that proving this to the police wouldn't be easy. They had already made up their minds about her guilt, and the system seemed to be working against her. After a long conversation with Daniel, Sarah knew they had to be patient. The legal system moved slowly, and although the evidence was strong, the police weren't eager to admit they'd made a mistake. Still, Sarah had one thing on her side: her determination. She couldn't give up now. The next day, Daniel submitted all the new evidence to the police. He had arranged a meeting with the investigating officers, hoping they would review the footage and take Sarah's alibi seriously. But when they met, the mood was tense. The officers seemed less than pleased that Daniel was questioning their investigation. One officer, a man named Detective Harris, looked over the documents with an air of disinterest. "We're aware of the footage," he said coldly, "but it's not enough to prove she didn't commit the crime. There are still gaps in the timeline, and we have other evidence that ties her to the scene." Sarah's heart sank. It felt like the officers weren't even listening to the facts. She wanted to argue, to scream that she wasn't guilty, but she knew that wouldn't help. Daniel, ever calm, spoke up. "Detective Harris, the witness statement isn't reliable. They couldn't have seen Sarah at the right time, and the footage confirms she was in the store well before the robbery took place. The real culprit is still out there, and we need to focus on finding them." For a moment, the room was silent. Detective Harris flipped through the papers again, then looked up, his face hard. "I don't see how this changes anything. You'll have to do better than this." Sarah's frustration grew. Why couldn't they see the truth? She had spent weeks feeling like a criminal in her own town, and now she was being dismissed again. But there was no time to feel sorry for herself. She had to stay focused. "We're not giving up," Daniel said firmly. "We'll continue to press for the truth. If you won't investigate this further, we will." Sarah nodded, her eyes meeting Daniel's. She could see the determination in his eyes, and it gave her strength. They weren't alone in this fight, even if it felt like the whole world was against them. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, trying to keep her mind calm. It had been a long day, and nothing had changed, but she refused to lose hope. She knew that the more they pushed, the more likely it was the truth would come out. Emily came over to visit that night. "How did it go?" she asked, sitting down beside Sarah. "It's frustrating," Sarah admitted. "The police aren't taking us seriously, but we're not stopping. We've come this far, and we'll keep going." Emily smiled, a quiet reassurance in her eyes. "I know you will. You've got this." Sarah smiled back, feeling a little lighter. Maybe the system was slow, but Sarah had one thing that no one could take away: her courage. And that, she believed, was the key to changing everything. Sarah had spent weeks feeling like she was stuck in a never-ending cycle of frustration and disappointment. The police weren't listening. The gossip in the town had only grown, and even though they had uncovered key evidence that should have cleared her name, nothing seemed to be changing. She had almost reached her breaking point, but then something unexpected happened, a discovery that would change everything. One afternoon, Daniel called her with news. "Sarah, I think we found the real culprit." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice full of hope. "I've been doing some digging," Daniel explained. "I tracked down a few more details about the robbery. And it turns out there was another witness who saw the person responsible. They mentioned something that the original witness didn't: the tattoo on the robber's wrist." Sarah's mind raced. "A tattoo? That's the first I'm hearing about it." "I know," Daniel said. "The first witness never mentioned it, and the police overlooked it. But I found out who the real robber is. His name is Greg Thompson. He's a local man with a criminal record." Sarah felt a rush of relief and disbelief. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Daniel confirmed. "I've cross-checked his movements, and his alibi doesn't hold up. He was in the area at the time of the robbery, and his tattoo matches the description from the other witness." Sarah was still trying to process the news. After all this time, after all the pain she had been through, the real criminal was right under their noses. "So what do we do now?" "We need to gather more evidence and present it to the police," Daniel said. "But this is big, Sarah. We've got a real lead now. Once we can prove it's him, we can clear your name once and for all." Sarah couldn't believe it. The past few weeks had felt like a nightmare, but now, with this new evidence, she could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope. Daniel worked quickly to collect more proof. They tracked down Greg Thompson's social media accounts and found posts that placed him near the crime scene at the time of the robbery. They also uncovered security footage that showed him leaving the area. With all this new evidence, Daniel was ready to go back to the police. When Sarah and Daniel presented everything they had uncovered to Detective Harris, the officer's expression changed. He studied the new evidence carefully, and for the first time, he seemed willing to listen. "I can't believe we missed this," he said, looking at the footage. "We'll have to arrest him." Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The police finally believed her. After weeks of stress, doubt, and frustration, she was starting to see the truth come to light. The next day, Greg Thompson was arrested. The police discovered that he had been the one behind the robbery all along. Sarah was officially exonerated, and the charges against her were dropped. Though she was relieved, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. It had been a long, painful journey, and it had changed her. But in the end, her courage had won. She had never given up, and now the truth was finally known. As Sarah stood in front of her house, looking at the bright sky, she knew this was just the beginning of her new life. She had faced the system, and against all odds, she had won. The day after Greg Thompson's arrest was a mix of emotions for Sarah. On one hand, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The police had finally acknowledged the truth, and the accusations against her were dropped. On the other hand, she felt a deep sadness and frustration. The past few weeks had taken a toll on her: her reputation, her peace of mind, and her sense of security. She had lost so much during this fight, but she had also gained something valuable: the courage to stand up for herself. Sarah sat quietly in her living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. She couldn't believe how much her life had changed in such a short amount of time. The once peaceful, small-town life she had enjoyed now felt distant, as if it had belonged to someone else. She had been labeled a criminal by her own neighbors, and though the truth had come out, the damage had already been done. That afternoon, Daniel called her. "Sarah, I know it's been a tough few weeks, but I want to make sure you know something," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You did the right thing. You never gave up, even when it felt impossible. That's what matters most." Sarah smiled, her heart feeling lighter. "I couldn't have done it without you, Daniel. I don't know where I'd be right now without your support." "You don't have to thank me," Daniel replied. "You're the one who had the courage to keep fighting, even when everything seemed stacked against you." Sarah thought about that for a moment. It was true. Her strength had carried her through the darkest times, but it had been a team effort. She wasn't alone in this battle. She had family, friends, and a lawyer who believed in her. Together, they had uncovered the truth, and that was something Sarah could be proud of. As Sarah walked down the street later that day, something unexpected happened. Her neighbors, who had once avoided her, now looked at her with more respect. Some gave her nods of acknowledgement, while others offered polite smiles. It was as if the weight of the accusation had lifted from their shoulders too. But not everyone was ready to forgive. A few of her colleagues at school still whispered about the case behind her back, and some of the parents continued to question her professionalism. Sarah knew it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been broken, but she was ready for that challenge. Sarah decided to take action. She began speaking with the school principal about ways to address the gossip in a way that would bring the community together. She wanted to clear her name and help others understand the importance of supporting each other through difficult times. Meanwhile, the local newspaper picked up her story. The headline read, "Wrongfully accused teacher proves her innocence." A story of courage and resilience. The article shared her side of the story, highlighting her perseverance and strength in the face of adversity. Sarah didn't seek the spotlight, but she hoped her story would inspire others who might find themselves in similar situations. In the weeks that followed, Sarah slowly began to rebuild her life. She continued to teach with the same passion and dedication she always had, and her students continued to look up to her. The community, though shaken, slowly started to heal. Sarah realized that her journey wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about discovering her own strength. She had fought for the truth, and in doing so, she had found the courage to move forward, no matter what. She could finally take a deep breath and feel at peace again, knowing that her fight had made a difference. Months had passed since Sarah's name had been cleared, but the memory of her struggle still felt fresh. The journey to reclaim her life and dignity had been long and painful, but Sarah knew she had come out stronger. She had faced the worst and emerged victorious, not just because the truth had been revealed, but because she had never given up. That determination had changed everything for her. Sarah was back to teaching, but things had changed. The whispers had mostly died down, and many of the parents who had once doubted her now approached her with support. They saw her as the person she always was, dedicated, caring, and patient. She had not only proven her innocence, but had shown the strength of character that made her respected by those who truly knew her. One day, as Sarah stood in front of her class, she looked around at her students, her bright, curious learners. She felt a deep sense of purpose. This was where she belonged. Despite the hardships, Sarah had continued to teach and inspire her students. She had shared her story with them in a way that helped them understand the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter how tough the journey might seem. But Sarah's story didn't end with just clearing her name. She had something more to give. The experience had opened her eyes to the injustices that many people face, especially those who are wrongfully accused. She decided to use her newfound strength to make a difference in her community. Sarah started volunteering at a local charity that helped people who had been wrongly accused or faced discrimination. She shared her story with others, helping them realize that they weren't alone in their struggles. She spoke at community meetings, raising awareness about how easily someone's life could be turned upside down based on false accusations. She advocated for fair treatment and the importance of trusting people's words until all the facts were clear. Her work wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about creating a community where people supported each other and understood that anyone could be wrongfully accused. Sarah knew that by speaking out and helping others, she could bring about real change. She felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that she was making a difference. As the months went by, Sarah's life continued to improve. She started to rebuild the trust with some of the people who had doubted her. Her relationships, both with friends and colleagues, grew stronger, and she felt more at peace with herself than ever before. Her courage had not only cleared her name, but had inspired others to be brave and stand up for what was right, even when the world seemed to be against them. Sarah had faced the hardest time of her life and emerged from it stronger, not just as a teacher, but as someone who had the power to inspire and make lasting change. As she stood in front of her class one morning, looking out at the eager faces of her students, she knew she had done the right thing. Her courage had changed everything, and she was determined to keep it that way.